My name is Sara, Jolena, and I am the director of a company that I have started, that I've had the fortune to start. It's a blessing, and I call it Sequoia Samanvaya. Sequoia for the great trees in California, which I have a very close relationship to, and the word Samanvaya means Sanskrit. And this is what you see on the screen here. This funny shape is a painting I did, which is in the process of becoming our company logo. And I'm extremely excited about, which I just got the draft of the logo like 2 days ago. So this is the original painting. So the digital logo is not yet ready yet. So our Upfront mission is essentially to support the formation of the beloved community in the Anthropocene age. The undercover mission of that is to unravel the doctrine of discovery and to re-enchant the world. And so that's, for those of you who are less familiar with the doctrine of discovery, that's essentially to say we're trying to decolonize and recreate the world together in a way that's going to be bringing towards the beloved community, which for many of you can easily translate into the kingdom of heaven. So we have a few things that we do a lot of. We do a lot of ceremonies and spiritual spaces and just worship design, major life transitions. We do online spiritual development programming as well as in-person programming. We do talks, workshops, retreats, and we do boutique consulting, research, and publishing. And we really do all of these things. All of these things are things that we are actively doing. We have things in the pipeline that we're not yet doing that will hopefully come out in 2019, such as podcasting and YouTubing and all that cool stuff. And most of my time and energy is on the online spiritual development courses. So most of it's in online education. Most of it is with people who are not in higher education currently. They have jobs, so they are leaders in their fields. They're mostly religious leaders and spiritual leaders. And they're also entrepreneurs, artists, filmmakers, dancers, environmental change makers, and other forms of activists. But we also work with the business community. So like a church, we are actually quite open to who we work with. And we have a diversity of people who come and take our programming. And then at the center, the very heart of the company, is something that we will never charge for. And that's our spiritual worship spaces for our community, which is growing. And that's an interfaith space. It's a multi-spiritual space, and it's usually right now it's both online and offline, depending upon what's needed and what we're doing, and sometimes a combination. So I graduated Union Theological Seminary in May of 2017, which is about 15 months ago. And I have to say, it's extremely exciting to say that since I graduated in the past 15 months, I have been able to pay my rent doing spiritual entrepreneurship work, and I have been able to pay my bills every month since then, doing this work. And that is something that I did not know was going to be possible when I graduated. And now, I have a team, and I pay people. I pay other people also. Not as much as they deserve, but I am able to make a contribution to their livelihood. And to be able to do that in a 15-month time period is a really basic metric of success. I'm getting some really positive, nodding heads here. So then the question I want to kind of explore with you is, how did I go from not knowing what I was doing in seminary and being like, what the heck am I doing in seminary? And what is this thing called call to ministry that I unquestionably experienced, to founding my own company where I'm making a difference in people's spiritual and practical lives every day. I pretty much at this point, every day, people tell me that I'm making a difference in their lives. And sometimes they send me pictures, and sometimes they send me quotes. And I mean, it comes in all sorts of different shapes and forms, but it's regular. And I'm not doing anything that resembles a traditional religious fashion, right? So what this slide is supposed to say is, what did I learn from seminary and what did I not learn from seminary? Before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about the context that we're in, which I think you're all familiar with, but just as a reminder. Our overarching religious landscape is rapidly shifting. Many of our churches, and particularly mainline Protestant, traditionally white churches, are dying. Right now, 50%, in 2014, according to the most recent Pew survey that I found, 50% of those attending religious services are over 50 years old. There's been a lot of failures in higher education, the online non-higher education space, as well as the online higher education space. Both are booming right now. And it's in part because people are, and this is not a seminary thing, right? This is not about seminaries. This is a wider graduate level education. People are spending a lot of money. They're taking out a huge amount of debt, and they are rarely prepared for the jobs that are available for them, which is frustrating for both them and their employers who want to hire them. And so the skills that they're getting in higher education are often not preparing them for the workforce, which is one of the reasons, by the way, that online education is actually booming, because it often provides skills and skill sets that people haven't learned in higher education, sometimes at a lower cost. There's a whole issue of like, what do you trust? What do you not trust? And that's a whole thing in of itself. At the same time, as the overarching religious landscape is changing and the higher education is a challenging situation, there's an increasing spiritual but not religious traditions, which are not easily organized, and which often, sometimes they have a center in which they come together, and like that's their kind of spiritual home, or the physical community through which they come to know each other, but a lot of times they don't. And this is all happening in the context of a critique of formal religious institutions, in which there is a general distrust of religious institutions. And that's true I would say that's true throughout the Abrahamic traditions, but particularly Christianity and Catholicism. And that's everything from sex scandals to your awareness of the damages done in the boarding schools. And that's all across the United States with different contexts in different places. And let's just stick to the US for today. I work internationally, but the religious cultural landscape is just very, very different. So just going to talk about here. Most people are experiencing an increased sense of uncertainty. And that has many, many factors to it. Most people are more overwhelmed. They're very, very tired. They're often confused. They often feel powerless. They feel that their action, whatever that has been, their activism is not impactful. They feel that whatever that activism is, they often feel disempowered in how little change that they're able to make. There's also economic uncertainty and a lack of stable career. So all of this is leading to a general confusion, general uncertainty, and like, where do I make a difference? And that question for people, I hear that question. I think all of us hear that question a lot. It's a huge need. So there's this huge need because of all these things, because of everything that is above this, there is an increased need for spaces for meaning making. That is a tangible need. They need to do it with other human beings. Sounds simple, but if people aren't going to church, and if they're not going to other forms of situations, but they are identifying as spiritual, but maybe they're Christian, but they don't trust their church because their church isn't dealing with these issues. Or maybe their church isn't adequately dealing with issues of diversity, and they want it to, but they don't know what to do. As a layperson who has a job, you only have so much time you can devote. So where are you going to go for meaning making? And how are you going to empower yourself? So these are all open questions that I knew about entering seminary. And there's a need for innovation, right? And the need for innovation is because the system is failing. And the system is failing on multiple things. So what do we mean when we say entrepreneur? If you Google Jesus as an entrepreneur, you will get a wide variety of sources to choose from. And I encourage you to consider doing that sometime if you want to stay up for about 10 hours. And there's it really deserves this. Multiple books have been written on this question. The relationship between Christianity, between Jesus in particular as a person, and God as a being, and business as a whole, is really like thick and complicated. And we're not going to talk about it a lot today, but it's worth very substantial engagement. We can certainly see that Jesus was a craftsman and he was a small business person. And when his father died, when Joseph died, he would have become a small business owner, responsible probably for his mother and other members of his family. And he made things that people found useful and in their daily life. And whether or not he was an entrepreneur, I think kind of depends in part on your definition of entrepreneur, but definitely a small business owner. And then some people I think would call him a spiritual entrepreneur. I don't want to go down that route because I actually feel that takes us in a different direction. The term entrepreneur usually denotes considerable financial risk. It's one of the things we traditionally associate with entrepreneurship, is your ability to take risks, especially financial risks, and to deal with uncertainty, to deal with a lot of uncertainty. And as a lot of my colleagues will say, like, there is, I think, a natural human tendency to find problems and to see opportunities, and opportunities in the social space, in the problems that we have in society, and to want to and to recognize that you have an ability to solve that problem, and that maybe if you can solve that problem either individually or collectively, you can also in some creative way, you can actually help to overcome that challenge, and maybe you can also financially benefit in the process. And I'll talk about this later, I hope, but I spent a fair amount of time in villages in India. And one of the things I've learned from them is the extent to which what we often think of as small entrepreneurship activities. It happens all the time in villages. People are constantly finding spaces of innovation. They're constantly finding ways of filling the need with some innovative solution for a problem in their community. And they're constantly finding a way of helping that inform their livelihood. Now, it's very important, like the word livelihood versus job, very big, important distinction when you're talking about these things. So people may not make a lot of money, but maybe they're going to help to feed their family through their ability to solve a problem in the village. So I can't this very human thing. There's a problem. I have a solution. We can work together to make something happen. We can engage in a process to bring about a solution, and we can create something from basically nothing. And then, of course, this brings up Genesis. What does it mean to be made in the image of God as a creative being? So I suggest, at least from my work, that there's 4 levels of spiritual of innovation that I'm doing. And I'm doing them right now. I do them all the time, which is interesting. So first is the core spiritual work. And that means, worship service, pastoral care, all that kind of core spiritual work. I'm constantly translating, because of the nature of what I teach. I'm constantly translating between groups of people, different people of different backgrounds and historical epochs, like time periods, different historical time periods, and different scriptures that people have, both real scripture and scripture that people think is real and isn't real. And I'm navigating vast traditions. Because I work in an interfaith context, I'm navigating multiple traditions. And I'm trying to bring people together to have moments when they can authentically bond and where they can experience the Holy Spirit in their midst, regardless of where they're coming from, and where the Holy Spirit can open them up and can lead them. That's core spiritual work. That's the basic. I'm channeling, I'm opening space, I'm channeling, and I'm letting the Spirit work. And I'm finding ways of doing that are not in traditional religious settings. So that's what I mean by innovating in spiritual spaces. And I do that in person, I do that online. Teaching, right? Like one of probably a very helpful thing that I heard that stayed with me in one of my very first preaching classes was that the single most important thing that the pastor brings is his or her capacity as a teacher, not as a social worker, not as a leader of an organization in other respects, but as a teacher. Like, what does it mean to help teach people? Our churches, our religious communities, are schools. They are where we go for ongoing baby to grave education. Ideally, that's where they are. And by education, I don't mean just education to read a book, I mean education that can help you transform your life in the midst of a colonial system that wants to destroy life-giving systems. That's what your spiritual community should be for. It should help you on ongoing basis of decolonization, right? And in a way that's nurturing to you, no matter who you are, who your ancestors were, and what they did, is nurturing so that you can help to change a larger system. And so that you get closer to, it's about getting closer to God, fundamentally. So as a teaching, I'm preaching, I'm doing ongoing content development. And in my case, ongoing content development is basically what an old boss of mine used to call intellectual entrepreneurship. I'm doing that pretty consistently. Then there's developing the internal dynamics of the community and the team. So I'm starting something from scratch. This has never happened before. There's never been an eco-theology company. There's never been an organization like mine. There's certainly never been a group that's trying to reach the level across different sectors and across different parts of society as I am doing, that I am aware of doing the types of things I'm doing. And I'm building it. I have a team. I am constantly developing what's the process for that team? How are they going to resolve conflict? How are we going to deal with challenges that come up? How are we going to do it when we don't meet our goals? That has very real consequences. And a small startup not meeting your goals has significant consequences. Not just, I am at this point in the game, I am much more concerned about my team than me. I'm really happy I have that problem. It's a great problem to have. And then there's all the stuff that comes with classic business entrepreneurship. What's your market niche? Networking, social capitals, customers, clients, marketing, sales. I said marketing multiple times because I spent a fair amount of time thinking about that. Accounting, taxes, payroll, technology, etc. So all those things. And a market that is actually not well defined. So there's not this market that I'm trying to tap into is not well defined. There isn't a whole lot of stuff that there are some things that do guide and some other metrics I can base it on, but not as many. So there's a strong overlap with what I'm doing with social entrepreneurship. I have a hardcore ecological, social, and financial bottom line for sure, and that's in everything we do. But at the same time, I call it spiritual entrepreneurship because the actual spiritual development of people and of communities is my primary goal. So everything I talked about, every level, every single part requires ongoing personal spiritual development. Like ongoing personal spiritual development. And I'm fortunate. I have, one of the first things that happened to me after I was going for a little while and I started getting students, I started having people following me and listening to me, was that one of my elders, I'm a Quaker by background, she's known me for 20 years or 15 years, came to me, we were having lunch one day and she said, "You need a spiritual elder." And I said, "Oh, okay." So you need a spiritual director. So she herself is a spiritual director. It was a hard sell. It worked. And I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful. I talk with her, I pay her money and I talk with her. And I have a lot more comfort around that than I used to. I think there would have been a time when I'm like, we should pay people. No. That's yeah. In what world should we not pay people for a lot of this work? There are certain situations where that's possible, but the church gets its money from somewhere. And if you're not in that context, someone's paying that bill. And she has to be able to show up for me. And that means she has to know her bills are paid. So it's so important that we are honest about that reality, because if we're not, we're really setting ourselves up for a lot more difficulty. I'm all about changing capitalism, but not with the individuals who I'm working with. I want them to be safe and secure, So I'm very grateful I have advisors and people who can help me. So some things that seminary in general is really good at. This is Riverside Church and Union background. Core spiritual work that I mentioned earlier and helping me learn how to do that better. I come from a Quaker tradition and I spent a fair amount of time in India and Southeast Asia and Africa. So I had a pretty good broad spiritual understanding coming in, but there's still a lot I didn't know. and knowing it within tradition, right? So knowing it within the context of the Christian and the Judeo-Christian tradition that goes back 2,000 to 5,000 years, and understanding, having a 2,000 to 5,000 year time frame that I can work with in my mind about how church history, super important. We were asking, like, what is classes that help me do this? And when I reflect on it, in terms of both the first two things I mentioned of what I do, the spiritual innovation and creativity, and the content development that I do, I use every class I took in seminary, every class. I use church history, I use pastoral care, I use clinical pastoral education, I use the leadership development, I use the 1 unit, SU class, the spiritual unit, I forget what they're called. I use the Ignatius spirituality, class I took, Desert Fathers, exegesis. I use everything. I didn't take Hebrew because I didn't have to. I'm sure I would use that too, honestly. So I use the knowledge all the time. I've also defined my company around the knowledge I learned. That's part of why I use it. Experiences. So all the internships I took, all the every internship I took, I took a clinical pastoral education. Every outside of school opportunity, I think I have put into use in the past 16 months. If there's anything I would do differently, I wish I had done more internships. Like if I was to do, probably, like in terms of what was easily available to me. Like I wish I had taken more opportunity to work with more churches, or work, just because I have learned so much in that. And part of what I learned, one of the most important things that happened during that process, is that doors closed. So I thought, oh, I'm a Quaker. I'm going to go and work in this like UCC church, and maybe I'm going to become a UCC minister. And I love that church. It was an amazing church. I had a great time. No way are they going to, like, if that's not a good fit, right? Like that door, like that doesn't really make sense for me from where I come from and who I am. And there's no way I think I really would have known that had I not done that. And I worked with because I knew I come from a climate change background, I worked with all the climate change groups I could. If there was a climate change, a religion group, I was a Green Faith Fellow. I worked with Interfaith Power and Light, or hung out with them on the weekends. I was very involved with the Center for Earth Ethics. All of these things, I went, because I knew that's where I came from. That's why I knew I wanted to work in some way. And that I also was like, oh my goodness, these guys can't hire me. They don't have the money. And I don't have the skill set they most need. They need a fundraiser. I'm not a fundraiser. And they anyway, so I figured out, I closed some, I was able to recognize, and they needed like a classical community organizer, which isn't actually my skill set either. I'm like, professional networking, professional confidence, language, very important, very, very important. I think people say it all the time. When I was in seminary, I did not believe them. They said language is important. How you tell your theological story is important. They're right. And I think even when I was interning and working with churches, I didn't get it as much as I do now. Like the language, experimenting with language, growing your capacity to articulate, growing your experiences in public speaking, listening deeply, all that's extraordinarily helpful. Sammy's not very good at anything that has to do with money, I think. And what do I mean by that? I'm not only joking. There's no courses on accounting. There's no courses on how do you keep, I think there was a 3-hour workshop on budgeting the entire 4 years I was in seminary. Maybe 2 or 3, because I have to admit I might not have gone because I was arrogant. But what does it mean to make money? What is your relationship to money? We live in a capitalist system. Most churches survive because of volunteerism. In some places, volunteerism means other stuff doesn't happen in those families, in those communities. If they're at the church all the time, maybe other things aren't happening. What's your relationship to how much should a pastor get paid? How much should a religious leader get paid, et cetera? This is particularly important given the fact that most graduate students take on a significant amount of debt. Seminary student debt, according to, there's some great research on this by Auburn Seminary, if you want to look it up. 30 to 100 grand of student debt, not unusual. For seminary education, that could be on top of undergraduate loans. Your average pastor, if you're lucky, earns more than 35 grand. A lot of churches, they'll are only half-time. In case you don't know, that is not a good ratio. And you're basically forcing yourself to go into a difficult financial position. And it's like either, as one article I read said, you've basically taken out the amount of money you need to buy a house without a house. And so for a lot of people, this puts them in an incredibly financially risky situation. And I would say that it's unethical of seminaries to not talk about money, given the extent to which their students are in debt for the education, which puts them into a position where most of the available jobs do not pay much. Academics, entry-level academia is 60 grand, maybe, depending where you are. Sometimes a bit more, sometimes a bit less. So we're not, even if you go for a PhD and get an entry-level academic job, it's not pretty. In a lot of nonprofits, you're not talking a lot more. You usually have to be an executive level. Most graduates from seminary, unless you have previous experience, are not easily, you didn't graduate with something on nonprofit leadership or something, right? Like, like your research probably didn't, you have to, so where are you going to go? How are you going to pay off that debt? So I actually knew that, right? I went to seminary anyway, which tells you I still have issues with money. But I think it's so important to be clear about these things.
And it was worth it.
And it was worth it. But I have been able to make choices many of my colleagues have not been able to make. Many people who graduate from seminary with my class or class above me are unable to, their jobs are not directly related to their education. And they're doing that primarily for financial reasons. That's why they'll take those jobs, because they have to pay off their debt. And it's not that they're bad. It's not that they regret going to seminary, but they feel stuck. And because they're like, we know how to do so much more. They are so underutilized. And then every chance they have to do one ritual, they get excited. So I'm trying to say that because it's like, I feel like we don't talk about that reality enough. And that means that we don't take seriously, what does entrepreneurship in this space look like? And not to say that I'm the only person or that I'm the best solution. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, without taking this reality seriously, you cannot open the conversation to say what's really going to work. What's really going to work so that many of us can solve these problems, right? And church and seminaries tend to go church, NGO, higher ed, hospitals, and chaplaincy. That tends to be it. And those jobs don't tend to pay well. And depending on your theory of change, they have various levels of ability to impact the system and various levels to impact change. And some of them, I don't actually want to say they don't have an ability. I think they do, but it's actually a kind of a, what should I call it? So I think the boldest way for me to say it is to say it's a very feminized sphere that is underpaid in consideration with the contribution that it makes to society. So all those things are largely caretaking positions and or advocacy positions that are usually often have a lot of women involved and often are undervalued by a capitalist male-dominated society. And a lot of seminary graduates are getting fed into that system because we aren't taking this first part seriously. And so we're not able to say, what's the other ways of doing things?
Although I will say Island is taking the money.
I'm really glad to hear that. Yeah, good. So I won't, yeah, cool, awesome. I'm really happy to hear that. Good. And then there's a lot of skills So, okay, now that I've kind of done some of that larger context stuff, a bit more about my journey. These are all my images or drawings, by the way. And that's why I enjoy making PowerPoints. So for me, this has been a journey of increasing faithfulness and increasing ability to share my voice with the world. But most important, to listen to God's guidance. So what does that mean? It means that probably the most important work that I have done in the past 15 years. So I would say I spent 15 years to get to here. The most important, so pre-seminary and seminary combined to get to what I'm doing now. The most important part of that probably has been me learning how God talks to me, right? Like, and what do I need? And for example, I need to play my music. I need to drum. I need to do my meditation. I need to do my prayers. I need to rest. I need to take naps. Those are all part of how I can listen better. As well as being with other people and just really letting myself be with them and not thinking about myself, right? All that kind of, basic pastoral education stuff, and increasing that. So for me, this is a path that I have visions. I don't know all the steps. I don't have all the strategy. And it's a process for me of really relaxing into God's love and trusting that and knowing that I put stuff out there that hasn't worked. I've taken some hits. And I would say I've met a lot of my own personal goals in the past year. And that's because I'm trusting God, and it's because I'm on the right path. It's not because I had a brilliant plan, but I spent 15 years cultivating that capacity, and cultivating it in a variety of different places. So and I think that seminary can help with that. I don't think seminary always does. I think it's what you bring to seminary, right? Like it's not, you can't just show up. You have to show up and do the work, do the spiritual work. I'm sure you know that. This is eldering on the bottom. So I received my call to ministry, healing, and eldering extremely early, and it very much confused me. Coming from a Quaker background, like we're not trained to think of ourselves as ministers. I've done hands-on healing work since I was a child. And I never really gave it and I got my massage therapy right after high school. I got my certificate. I never thought it was going to be anything I did seriously. A few times I would have to rely on it for income, but I didn't see it as like a thing. I didn't see it as core to me until in the middle of seminary when I went through a crisis. And I started doing more healing work with people, and I now call it sacred body work. I've been doing it ever since. I will do it. If I make $1 million, I will keep doing it. Because it's now core to how I see myself in the world. And I recognize the power that my hands have, and I acknowledge that, and I own that in a way that I never used to do. And that came in while I was in seminary. But what this also means is it means that I have a skill that is always in demand, that is easily recognizable. People know exactly what I'm talking about. Even I do different things with it. People don't know exactly what I do. I do my own thing with it, but people know what, you go, you lie on this table, you feel good afterwards, like, great. And people it's a box that people can put me in, and it means I can make some money when other things are in flux. And that's really important, like having something that you can do that doesn't drain you and hopefully makes enough money so you don't have to do it 60 hours a week in order to pay your rent. This is true for almost any entrepreneur activity. If entrepreneurship, when you're starting an organization, you're either going to get financed, either a grant, there's not many choices. You get a grant for a nonprofit, you get an investor, or you bootstrap it. And I'm doing a crazy thing no one's heard of before. I didn't think there'd be very many investors. I'm bootstrapping. That's and it also has to do with who I am and my own stuff, like my own pride and things. But I wanted to know I wanted to build it from scratch too. Like, it's also me. Before seminary, I spent a fair amount of time working international development as a researcher, and I lived around the world. These are some people who are still extremely important in my life, and I go to India regularly, and I have ongoing relationships and ongoing things. So what did that mean in terms of what I did later? Is that during that journey, I recognized the importance of art, music, dance, and ritual. I understood, having done that like international development work, I knew I had been able to go on a journey, and I knew what was missing. I knew that the religious and art ritual stuff was missing, and I knew how important it was on a very like practical level. And I understood how old, ancient communities survived and how they have been destroyed, both by colonial systems. And I had seen it, and I had lived with that. And so I understood the importance of culture. And that helped give me faith in what I was doing. And I understood that was intertwined with livelihoods and trade. And those things weren't separate. I understood that like, you don't have to, music and livelihoods can go together, that art and creation and ritual can all be woven together, that these aren't, and you don't have to separate these things out. I also, during that time, I significantly increased my capacity to witness other people suffering. And that I increased that again in seminary, but I started those skills prior to seminary. I learned a lot about money and my relationship to it. I think it's unique for everyone. I learned how I deal with uncertainty and how much risk I'm comfortable with, what I'm willing to sacrifice for, and some of my core values that I'm willing to go after. So for example, I am very willing to invest in building my own podcast. I am very unwilling to help edit someone else's podcast. Even if they pay me X amount of money, I'm only willing to help them if they pay me Y amount of money. But I will invest. So stuff like that. And I knew that before I graduated seminary. So that enabled me to make some fast choices. I happen to be very good at dealing with uncertainty. I happen to be very good at dealing with risk. I have it's sometimes 2 months. So long as I have if I have less than I need about a month before I need to know where my money is coming for the next period of time. For a lot of people, it's 6 months or a year. They can't handle not knowing where the next paycheck is going to come from for the next 3 or 4 months. I can actually handle a lot of financial uncertainty. If it's like less than 2 weeks, I freak out. Right? I can't handle it. If my rent's due in 2 weeks, and I have had times on this journey, but I've put things in place already usually by that time. So that, like, how you deal with financial uncertainty, how you deal with, there's so many uncertainties that come when you're starting anything new, nonprofit, church, whatever. So how do you deal with uncertainty, and what's your relationship with God in that process? Like, that is something and I knew some of my own weaknesses and strengths professionally before seminary. And I got to and I knew how to spot opportunities. Traveling, of course, I don't know, traveling is a big part of my life. It always has been. I had a really hard landing in seminary. Personally, it was really hard for me. And I cried all the time. And so there was a lot, one of my favorite quotes is, "You never waste a crisis." So a lot of the deep work, the internal work I did in seminary was extraordinarily important. I developed a much deeper relationship to God. I've mentioned a few of these before. These are just, some of the internships I did. As someone working in climate change, I did my CPE at Rikers Island's correctional facility. That was invaluable. That has proven to be, working inside in the prison for a year, undoubtedly one of the most helpful things I've done, and in ways that have been unexpected. So in some ways, you know, I entered seminary, I had a very hard time. I was like, what the hell am I doing here? Excuse my language. I knew I had a call to ministry. My father died. I took some time doing nothing. I always believe in taking time to do nothing. I think that's very important. And then in my third year, which should have been the year I graduated, this is one of my friends, Stanley. They were really like, it looked like they were getting picked up by all these cool groups. I was getting a lot of closed doors. And I was beginning to focus on my thesis. And I had an intellectual insight. I had a theological intellectual insight into the climate change and the doctrine of discovery. And I understood what it came from a series of classes I took at that time. I saw what my MDiv thesis was going to be. I understood what it's going to be. And I got probably the best advice I had gotten from a student who was older and more mature than I was, and who was like at least 10 or 15 years older. And she said, take a fourth year to do your thesis. Stay an extra year. Take your time. Take your time. Do your thesis well. Don't rush it. Don't jump all over the place. Do this work, because this time is precious. This time when you get to delve into this piece is precious. And so she was telling me this, and I was taking classes with Sam Freeman at the Columbia School of Journalism, and he recognized my gift for what he called pastoral editing. And that for me was an experience of I was in a class of journalism students, and I became their pastor. And it's like, it had been hard in all these like formal religious contexts to become their pastor. Then here I was in a journalism class, and it was like, boom. And for me, it was one of those, oh, I'm really good at unconventional ministry. I have a gift. I'm like, okay at regular ministry. I could probably jump through those hoops and become a pastor, but I'm really good at unconventional ministry, and our world really needs unconventional ministers. And the end of our class, I ended up doing a whole sermon, like literally a sermon from All the Light That We Cannot See, which was one of the class's favorite books. Love that book. And I treated it like a religious service, and everyone responded. And by that time, like, I had done pastoral editing for every one of their book projects. So those were those kinds of, so all that meant that I took an extra year. And in that summer, so this is the summer before I graduate, the summer before my final year, my fourth year, which for many people in their MDiv program would be the summer before their third year, I went across the United States and I went to New Orleans, Alabama, Tennessee, Colorado, New Mexico, and California. And I basically did a series of experiments, which was essentially me trying to figure out what I was going to do with this seminary education. I started thinking, because I just done all this writing, that I was going to be an eco-justice, religious, spiritual journalist. And I was going to make my life for the next 10 years as a writer. And that totally failed, like utterly failed. I had a crisis. That's when I started doing more one-on-one healing work with people. And I started offering workshops on the material that I've been developing for the early stages of what I was developing for my thesis. And when I did those work, and I started doing it in different places, this group here, the people in this picture is at the Quaker Institute for the Future here, and we had a meeting here in Denver, and that was the first time that I presented my work. And several people, including people who are now here, were at that presentation. And that presentation led me to be invited to another thing, which led me to be invited to another thing, which led me to do a series of workshops also here in Denver. I did 7 workshops in 4 days or something, 3 days. I did short workshops. And I realized there was a demand for my material. And it was basically, I can now say that I was piloting my work. I didn't know that I was piloting at the time. And what I knew was I knew that there was an audience, and I knew that there was a demand for what I was doing. So I was like, I had, through my own journey, like found a problem, and I had figured out how to address the problem, and I had figured out how to communicate that, and through my own personal journey, right? And then I tested that, and I realized other people wanted to know the answer to that question. And other people also wanted to go through a process of decolonization. And other people also wanted to know what land that they're standing on. This is Arapaho Cheyenne land. And they wanted to know that I came from a lonely land. And they wanted to know, what does it mean to build better relationships with the people of the earth, including first and foremost, our own bodies and our own selves. And I recognized that I had something that I could offer that, and that people were going to pay me for it. But it was mostly the fact that I had something to offer. The fact, because people were paying me for the workshops. They were just donations, but I collected enough money during that summer for each next stage of the journey. So I was literally living like, I was living on almost nothing that summer, like financially. And it ended up working. And that gave me that gave me confidence. It gave me huge confidence. But it's like, I don't think there's anything like that. There's nothing like testing your ideas in this field. And it doesn't, it's like, you have to get in the field, whatever the field means for you. And I didn't even know what my field was until I was out there. I didn't know who my audience was until I was speaking to them. That's just how my journey was. And that's why you have to have that trust in God. And that's why you have to trust the journey, because there's a lot of unknowns. That's what it means to do high level innovation. When you don't know who your audience is before you're talking to them, and suddenly it clicks and you're like, okay, this is it. This works. That's high innovation. And that enabled me to do probably the most important thing, which is to throw my head in the ring. And that I think that our commitment is probably our most important thing as entrepreneurs, or as religious leaders also. Your commitment to yourself and to the work that you're developing. So then so this is me writing my thesis. I gave myself an entire semester of basically only doing this. That's basically all I did. And I'm still, now I'm working on a book. Probably the best thing, that was probably the best decision I made in seminary, was to really slow down and to invest so I became an expert. I couldn't have done it. I don't think I would have let myself do it. I wouldn't have had the courage to do that if I hadn't known people wanted the material, right? So I recommend testing things out before you give that level of investment. Because if I had just invested without testing first, I don't know where I would have gone. But I knew who I was kind of talking to. I kind of knew what they needed to hear. And I had that in my mind the entire time that I was like, you see, it's getting dark outside. I was like all day, all night, I was working like hell on the intellectual material. The other thing I was doing is I was looking for other ways of doing things. And I found some online people who I respected, and I started paying attention to how they did stuff. And the key thing that happened for me is I realized that I could offer an online course, which I had like no experience in online education. I am not a technological person. I don't like technology. I could offer an online course, and I could pilot it, and I could charge for the pilot. And like that one insight was like the thing that got me going. I could pilot my now I would call it a product, now that I could become better at using that language. I turned in my thesis. I got my first consulting job as an eco-theologian in India. That was pretty awesome. So I spent that whole winter break in India. I had a stable, beautiful home that I moved into 2 months after 2 months before I graduated seminary. That's us down there. That's actually us with one of my teachers, Larry Rasmussen. And I was going deeper into my healing work with one of my teachers there. And I was starting to do some coaching, which is, I don't know, I thought that you can't really see it. Oh, well, okay. I do a little bit of coaching now, but not much. Because I can't do everything. So I'm focusing on the courses because that's because I invested all those hours with my work. So I'm actually an expert. And like when you're an expert in something, you want to like do that. So I do a little bit of coaching now, but at that time I didn't know what was going to really click. So I was doing some coaching, but not a lot. So the house is super important because that meant that I had a place to live that I liked. I knew what my rent was. I knew my expenses, and I could live there after I graduated seminary. And I was content with that. Like, I was happy. I led my first summer solstice in the Sequoias, which was pretty amazing. So now I add a lot of value to people's lives, and I created this company, and we do amazing education work. And it's pretty awesome. And here are some different quotes that people talk about from the ways why they keep taking my courses. And it's really varied. I don't know. So, and this in some ways is what keeps me going, is I collect testimonials. I started doing that relatively early. It's one of the advices I took. Shortly after graduating, I listened to a lot of podcasts about running your own business, and I had a lot of catch-up work. I had worked as an entrepreneur. I had worked in startups before, but there's a lot of stuff about running a business I didn't know. So I listened to a lot of podcasts, and I listened to a lot of online stuff. If you don't know this already, there is a huge world of people online who are going to try to teach you how to run your business. And especially if you want to do it from values, from a base of values or morals or ethics or spirituality, most of those people have never been to seminary. Most of them have no idea what seminary education is. Most of them have no idea what a deep tradition, church tradition is. Most of them have no idea how to engage with something like decolonization while you're trying to build a business. Most of them don't have the language that we have. They've never worked with scripture before. And they don't know how to bring people to scripture if that's important to them at all, which for a lot of them it's not. Or they think that being an entrepreneur is like, they have a kind of prosperity gospel kind of thing going on. And I'm not, and like, not to say they don't have a lot to offer. I'm not saying that. Some of them do, some of them don't. Obviously, like any field, it's extremely hard to figure out who's who, who's good and who's not good, because everyone has cool quotes like this on their website. But we do, right? Like that's what's real, and because these are cool quotes. And yeah, and I have a team. I have people who teach my material, and I think on a daily basis about my new problems, which include what's the next level to bring in more money to pay my people on my team. I think I'll just end with saying, podcasts. We're going to the Parliament. I have a booth at the Parliament. I paid for a booth at the Parliament that cost like $1,200. I did it in partnership with another organization to help with the finances. When I saw the cost of that booth, I was like, how the hell am I going to do that? And it happened. I made enough money that month to pay that bill. So like, I'm talking about all these things because this is the reality of half the time you're like, how am I going to pay that bill? How am I going to pay that bill? How am I going to pay that bill in order to do all these amazing things that I want to do? And the fact that I've been able to do it, and I've had 6 or 7 both academic and non-academic publications come out in this past year, and that my team is all engaging in research, and we're actively engaging in future publications without having any money from a research institution. So we don't have a lot of things that, like, I now can look at, like, I now have a lot more respect for all the resources big institutions have. It's amazing. They have like scanners that work. Wow. But like, there's something amazing about what we get to do. And it's amazing about the communities that we get to form and the people we get to touch. And I know that we're doing something that can, in time, grow and expand. And so I guess, so the final story I just want to leave you guys with is that I really do mean it when I say that for me, this has been a path of miracles. And one of my examples of that is that, well, I have lots of them, but one of them is that sort of in that 4th year, I went to a conference at the American Indian Institute, hosted a conference between settler people and indigenous elders, or indigenous people, including a lot of indigenous elders. And my roommate in that conference was a young woman, younger than I am, of Seneca descent. So she's, that's Haudenosaunee, First Nation, and commonly, inaccurately known as the Iroquois. And we became immediate friends. She subsequently took my first class I taught on Howard Thurman. She knew nothing about theology, had grown up in a Methodist church and didn't know Howard Thurman. This doesn't say anything about which church she grew up in. Lots of people don't know about Howard Thurman. One of the greatest theologians of American and preachers of American history, I would say. And the man who brought, in many ways, was amongst those who brought all this wonderful work to the US from India. Okay, so I can get in my lecture on Howard Thurman another day. But so I taught a class on Howard Thurman. She joined it because I told her she would love it, and she did. And that led her to take more classes, and that led her to do some of the work she's now doing in terms of writing her book. And that led her, and then in the process of her taking my classes and the conversations we were having, she became the first person to join my team and the first person I've been able to pay. We subsequently, after we met and before I started paying her, but I learned that my ancestors and her ancestors knew each other about 300 years ago. And they probably sat together in the same ceremony in the Longhouse. And they probably smoked the sacred pipe together in not far from where she lives now, up in Albany, New York. And my ancestors and her, they undoubtedly knew each other, and they almost certainly, my ancestors were somewhat responsible, were amongst those who were responsible for breaking the treaties that they had signed with the Haudenosaunee people, including the Seneca people. And she is now on my team, and she holds me to the fire. And she helps make sure and when she joined, she said, I want to join because you practice humility. And I said, I do, because I was not sure that was true at all. I don't feel I practice humility nearly as much as I could. And she said, there is a willingness to listen that I haven't seen in most of the organizations that I've been applying to work for. And that came from my journey, and that came from me being authentic with myself, and the fact that I'm able to support her in getting her voice into the world, and that I'm able to support her in developing dialogues and speaking across difference. She brings 1,000-year diplomatic history and heritage to that, because the Haudenosaunee are phenomenal diplomats. And I've learned a lot about diplomacy from her. So it's like, maybe someday I'm going to work for her. I don't know. We don't know where these things are going to go. And I kind of just offer that as like those are the kinds of miracles that I get to live my life in, and that I get to be building entrepreneurial work with people who my ancestors tried to destroy is an ongoing reminder of God's love and of the ultimate triumph. And I don't want to say triumph, but the power of love and the power of truth, and of letting ourselves be truthful.